Our next speaker is here to talk about your power as a parent. Elli Brimble from Citizen Health will guide us through how your data can fuel real progress in diagnosis and treatment. Please welcome Elli Brimble.
All right. This sounds like it's working. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, it is my deep honor to be here with you all today. We've had a really successful partnership so far with this foundation, and I'm really looking forward to sharing more about the opportunities that we have together. All right, so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about who I am and how I got there. I have two different hats that I wear, and I have a really hard time taking both of them off, as you'll see if I corner you to start talking about FOXG1. But I support another foundation as well called the FOXG1 Research Foundation. This is another genetic neurodevelopmental disorder. And really, our mission at the foundation is similar to the ZTTK Foundation, where we're really looking to fund and catalyze transformational research to develop therapeutic strategies for this particular rare disorder. And at the foundation, I'm responsible for our overall clinical data strategy. So we're really fortunate that we have a lead gene therapy candidate that we're moving into the clinic in 2026. And so we've done a lot of work of thinking about how can we galvanize the community to generate data to really ensure the success of that clinical trial. And so I'm really excited to share some of those learnings with this community in hopes of making that journey a little bit more efficient. The other hat that I wear, and you'll see our colorful booth outside with Mikkel, is at Citizen. And our mission at Citizen is really to provide relief to families who are living with rare disorders by collecting clinical data, both in hopes of supporting clinical development of new therapies, but also developing strategies and tools to make your day-to-day lives easier. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about why clinical information is important, what are the clinical data initiatives that are active today for ZTTK, what can we learn from these data initiatives, and then what are the roles that we can all play to help move this effort forward faster. So first, why is data important for drug development? So, we actually have lots of ideas. Having good ideas is not necessarily the challenge. What we really need to understand is how can we put those ideas into practice? So we start with lots of really interesting and exciting ideas. Maybe we start to dig into some of those ideas, and we notice right away that some of those are fizzling out. Maybe they weren't as good as we thought they were at the beginning. Then maybe we start testing some of those ideas out in different models, like we just heard about, and maybe we actually learn that some of those are not safe. And then ultimately, we may eventually learn that some of those are not effective. And so, we started out with a lot of really interesting ideas for how we might approach a treatment strategy, but very quickly, those may be whittled down into only one good idea. And so a lot of the work that we're doing from a data initiative standpoint is how do we get to this one good idea faster versus investing time and resources in those many interesting ideas that maybe are not actually going to move the needle. So this kind of takes us overall to clinical data and what we can do to help support those efforts. So you in your own lives may have experienced many questions that come up when facing a medical and healthcare community that may not have the answers that you're looking for. So things like, what would a meaningful change for my sunshine look like? How can I best illustrate the burden of disease or the lived experience for my sunshine and my family? What does ZTTK look like today, and how might that change over time? How is ZTTK different in an adult versus an adolescent versus an infant? So we have lots of different questions that we want to answer, and we can kind of start to group those into two different strategies. So first of all, we have kind of a community management and disease characterization strategy where we're really looking to understand what does ZTTK look like and how can we best support the community in managing, caring for someone with ZTTK. And then on the other side, we also want to start thinking about how can we make the future better for everyone living with ZTTK. So how do we prepare for clinical trials? But then how do we also start advocating to sponsors and to regulatory agencies to prepare them for when we're really ready to submit information about a candidate therapy? So the clinical data initiatives that are active today, which I greatly encourage everyone to participate in, and if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But there are two really great initiatives that the foundation has invested in. So the first is RareX, which is really focused on collecting information directly from you. So hoping to understand what are your experiences with this condition, and how can we start to generate some data from the patient's perspective or the family's perspective. And then what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is Citizen, and we have really focused on generating longitudinal clinical data sets that come from medical record data or some of the information that you're already contributing. All right, so this is the Citizen data pipeline. First and foremost, we are a patient-centered and patient-initiated platform. So you are able to reach out and sign up and create a profile with the platform. When you do, you can provide consent for us to collect your medical records on your behalf. So we leverage one of the regulations in the United States that gives you access and rights to own your own medical record information called HIPAA. Those medical records are then uploaded to our system. We process them and we organize them. And then we have a clinical team, actually led by Emily, who's here today, who really carefully and thoughtfully scans those medical records to start pulling out relevant information that helps describe what the clinical engagements and interactions look like over the course of someone's lifespan. And then lastly, we also have the ability to start generating insights from this disorder. So how do we take these hundreds of thousands of pages across tens of hundreds of patients and start to put together a story that you can start using to educate those around you? All right, so a few ground rules that I wanted to talk about first. There was some really great discussion earlier about what does ethics look like in rare disease research. And so these are some of the principles that we've instilled to try to address some of those concerns that come up. So first and foremost, patients are partners. If you register for Citizen, you own your data and you direct who uses it and how they use it. All medical records that we collect and all the data that we annotate from those records are made available back to you so that you can use that information to help facilitate your own medical care. And then also importantly, our business model supports revenue sharing, both with the advocacy organization and with you as patients. So if any of your data were used in an engagement that generated revenue, so for example, say that you had a sponsor who wanted to look at the ZTTK data and use that to help support their own drug development, part of that money would go back to you and part of that money would go back to the foundation. In terms of research ethics, we only share de-identified data when you give permission for it to be shared. So if you wanted to join the platform but not share that data beyond the foundation, for example, that is perfectly fine. Any use of the Citizen data must be covered under the consent. So if you consent for one type of study, we can't go and share that information for a different type of study. It all has to be within the confines of what you've already approved. And then lastly, all use of the Citizen data needs to be supported by an IRB study, which essentially is an independent review board that ensures that the proposed study is safe and that your privacy and safety are prioritized in the design of that study. All right, so some of our successes so far, this is beyond just the ZTTK Foundation, but what we've been able to support for a number of different rare disease groups so far is that we've really worked hard to establish relationships with many different healthcare centers across the United States. So on this map here, every dot represents an institution, a practice, a small doctor's office where we've been able to collect medical records from. That's over 3,000 institutions so far. We are able to collect all the information that's stored within the medical records. So yes, this includes some of the notes and the reports coming off of imaging or EEG studies that you may have had, But this also includes the raw materials as well, so we can collect the actual imaging files for any brain MRIs you've had, for example. The raw EEG tracings we're able to collect as well, and we have some partners looking at EEG biomarkers, for example. So we're really trying to collect the wealth of information that is already being generated. And then most importantly, our collection follows the patient throughout their lifetime. So we're not just looking at a single point in time, but we're collecting information from any institution or practice where your sunshine may have been seen. And really that's ensuring that we can capture the full breadth of information, even if you've moved or been to different centers over time. All right, so what shows up in the data that we generate? We try to do a really thorough job of characterizing all of the features that may be identified for a given person. So we don't want to limit our searches to things that we already know about. We want to try to identify the full spectrum, even if that means we're surfacing things that may not have been a known association in the past. So this will look like any symptoms or diagnoses, developmental outcomes, seizure frequency, growth parameters, and measurements over time. We also try to be thorough in describing the diagnostic workup so that we can not only understand what the diagnostic odyssey looks like, but also start to get a sense of how many procedures, how many interventions are being reported to really start to characterize what does it mean to live with this condition, because that can be really powerful in some of your engagements when we want to start thinking about advocacy. And then lastly, we want to understand how are people managing this condition today in hopes of starting to tease apart what is working, what is not working, and then how can we use that to inform better treatment strategies in the future. All right, and then just kind of another plug. So what would happen if you contributed your data and it was shared with one of the researchers in this room, for example? So first, your privacy is protected. Only your de-identified data would be shared. And in our agreements, those researchers promise that they will make no attempts to try to re-identify that data. As I already stated, in terms of the consent, the researcher's use of the data must be consistent with what you have already provided consent for. The researcher must have had a research protocol written up and approved by one of those independent review boards. And then they also must commit to meeting certain security standards that we ask for, just to, again, ensure that that data cannot be accessed externally. All right, so now I'm excited to share a little bit of the data that we've been able to pull together from this community as you've been kind of amping up recruitment. It's been really exciting to see. So we actually had our first ZTTK patient enroll back in August of 2023. But since then, you can see over time, oops. Okay, maybe there's not a laser. But over time, you can see that that is really starting to grow. So as of July, we have 46 individuals with ZTTK enrolled. Mikkel just shared that 3 more people have signed up. We are really looking to get to 50 by the end of this conference. So again, if you have any questions, please reach out to Mikkel, who's sitting out front. What that means in terms of data, so we're not done our data collection yet, but of those patients for whom we've been able to start collecting records, this amounts to over 100,000 pages of medical records. So this could be a really powerful data set that we're already starting to generate. In terms of the patient population who's onboarded, we have a pretty good distribution of ages. So unsurprisingly, the majority of individuals are under 12 years of age, but we do have a handful of individuals who are adolescents or adults, and that can again be really powerful in illustrating what the future looks like. And then a pretty equal distribution between females and males. In terms of where individuals are coming from, again, there's a huge global presence, which is very exciting to see. We've already started to see individuals enrolling from different countries. And then even within the United States, each dot represents a family who's enrolled, and we have really nice coverage across the US as well, which is exciting to see. All right, so I wanted to kind of start diving into some of the potential of this data. So I selected 2 random individuals who had enrolled in Citizen and who we'd completed medical record collection and data extraction for. And then I thought it might be interesting to kind of compare their journeys and what we're able to start teasing out from those records. So what you'll see in this image is there are sort of 2 lines of dots, and those represent 2 individual patients. And then along the bottom axis is the age of those patients in months. So we can see that the top row corresponds to someone who was about 6 years of age, and then at the bottom row is someone who's a little bit younger, around 1 year of age. And then I tried to color code the dots so that you could start to kind of make comparisons between some of the common symptoms that were reported in both patients, but it's a little bit difficult to see because there are a lot of symptoms that are being described. So a couple things that I wanted to point out is if you look at kind of the first dot on the far left of the screen, you'll see that both patients, the earliest data points that they have are actually the same colors. And in both patients, we saw respiratory challenges. We saw that they were smaller than we might expect for them to be based on their gestational age at birth. Both individuals had reflux, and then both individuals had distinct physical features noted on birth as well. One individual, you can see the younger patient had congenital heart defects observed. And so when we look in the literature, we know that a proportion of individuals are described with congenital heart defects as well. And then their paths start to diverge a little bit. So we can see if we look at the younger participant that they had sleep problems and just sleep problems very early on. And then they actually received their diagnosis quite young. So that yellow star is when they were diagnosed with ZTTK, and that was at about 6 months of age. And then by 12 months of age, they had some strabismus, so the eyes were not completely aligned. One of their eyes moved a little bit. And then they also had abnormal breathing reported. Then if we look at the older individual, their journey looks a little bit different. So they were diagnosed with developmental delay a little bit later on. They were described as having lower muscle tone a little bit later. Around 2 years of age, they started having behavioral differences, and they were eventually diagnosed with autism. They ultimately had abnormal movements, and it wasn't really until they were around 4 years of age that they received their ZTTK diagnosis. And then over time, they were eventually diagnosed with intellectual disability, sleep apnea, constipation, and anxiety. So I think this is just the beginning of what we can do, but we're already starting to understand a little bit about how do different patients maybe look differently from one another, and why might that be? One question I'm curious about in these examples is why was one patient able to be diagnosed so early, whereas the other one we can see had a number of symptoms before they achieved their diagnosis, so helping to understand that journey a little bit better. And then starting to know when do certain symptoms emerge over time, and how can we do a better job at preparing families and the educators and the healthcare system to be able to accommodate those symptoms before they actually emerge. All right, so the last thing I looked at is the different medications that patients were taking. So I thought this was pretty powerful. We just looked at all of those different symptoms that were reported. And in these 2 patients, even though there was quite a big difference in their age, there wasn't really a big difference in the number of different medications they were using, which I think is pretty powerful in describing the complexity of this disorder. So the first patient was on 14 unique medications, and then the second patient was on 11 unique medications. And then I just made a bit of a word cloud to try to get a sense of why were so many different medications being used? What were some of the symptoms that they were being used to treat? And I have to say I was a little bit surprised by what came out. It wasn't necessarily what I was expecting. But both patients had allergies reported as symptoms, and the majority of their medications were actually to treat their allergies. So I think this is something that will be interesting to keep an eye on as we start to gather more data for more individuals. And then we see things like sleep, reflux, A number of different supplements were being used. But then things like, seizure medications, pain medications, both patients were on pain medications, which I also found interesting. So I think we can start to tease apart some areas that warrant further investigation and helping us better understand how to maximize quality of life. Okay, so I wanted to switch gears just a little bit to talk about some of what I'm really excited about for this community based on what we've learned with FOXG1 so far. And so I kind of wanted to share a little bit about how FOXG1 has been using the citizen data and the ways that we found it to be quite powerful. All right, so as I mentioned already, the FOXG1 Research Foundation has a very similar mission as ZTTK. We have a gene replacement therapy candidate that's moving into clinical trials. And, we were kind of in a similar setting where we don't have big grants coming from the government. We don't have any pharma interest in our particular condition. And so we've had to be really strategic about how do we do things because we don't really have money or time to waste. And so we've really relied on the citizen data that we've generated to be the backbone of our strategy overall. So we are using the data set that is being generated for ZTTK right now for community and clinician support and education. Something we heard a lot about yesterday is that families felt pretty alone when they received their diagnosis, and there was really very few places to turn, and you weren't getting the answers that you needed from your clinician. So how do we start doing a better job for families who will be getting new diagnoses? This data has been powering our preclinical development, so all of the wonderful cell lines and animal models that were discussed earlier. We've been strategic about which ones we invest in building, and the way that we've done that is by looking at what is the human symptomology that we want to recreate in these models and ultimately treat. As we start thinking about our clinical trial design, we've been relying on this data for that. And then something that may come up depending on the therapeutic strategy that we end up taking for ZTTK is what are the FDA and EMA and other regulatory bodies' requirements going to be after that drug is available. So these are all new experimental therapies in small populations. There are going to be safety and monitoring requirements afterwards, and how do we prepare to do those? All right, so first and foremost, when we think about that community engagement piece, we really want to understand how do symptoms present and how do they change over time. So this is data coming from FOXG1, but you'll see a lot of similarities where we're looking at some of the most common symptoms and when they start. And part of what we're trying to answer here is what are some information that I can share with newly diagnosed families. What is my future going to look like? What kind of information can we share with a younger family in helping them prepare and maximize success and outcomes for an older individual? We also want to start thinking about how we characterize different symptoms, especially those that we might measure in a clinical trial. So for example, if we're looking at seizures, for our FOXG1 community, it was strongly recommended that we consider measuring seizures in our clinical trial. But when we started looking at the data, in this particular image here on the far right, the bottom row that is darkest is the proportion of patients who actually have very controlled seizures. And so our data showed us right away that if we tried to design a trial around counting seizures, we wouldn't have enough seizures to count. And so that could have jeopardized our only shot at goal in this clinical trial. And so we were able to deprioritize seizures as one of the things that we were going to measure and then focus on something that actually made sense for the condition and wasn't just kind of a recommendation coming from above. One thing that I'm really optimistic about and trying to really leverage the citizen data to do is how do we do a better job at really showing what the lived experience of these conditions is. For better or worse, you might think that the government or the FDA knows what these conditions are. They don't. They have no idea. They don't understand what your lives look like. And so how do we force them to see what that is so they can be better partners to work with. So one of the ways that we've started doing that is trying to measure how can we look at the totality of symptoms and the totality of interventions to really illustrate the overall burden or severity of a condition and how that might change over time. So one of the questions that I get a lot from families is, should I expect this to get worse? Is this a degenerative disorder? And a lot of times we don't have good information on how to answer those questions. And so this is part of what we're doing with FOXG1 is starting to plot out disease severity over time so that we know how to answer that question for families. And then the right image here is not just looking at how things might change over time, but what are some of the things that we might be able to see in a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old that would predict whether someone may have a more complex outcome over time, so we could help that family prepare earlier and potentially start implementing more strategies to be proactive about managing that in advance. So for instance, in FOXG1 syndrome, we found that missense variants are associated with a less complex outcome. We can see that individuals who have a larger head circumference by 1 year of age have a less complex outcome. And then individuals who have an earlier seizure onset are more complex. So we might have different management strategies that we recommend for those families depending on some of those key criteria. All right, and then lastly, this is one of my favorite figures that we've put together. Although to Nina's point, no one wants to publish this figure, so misaligned incentives there. But one of the biggest questions that we get from communities, and a sentiment that's expressed a lot is like, I feel like a guinea pig. I feel like people are just throwing different medications at me and no one really knows what they do and they can't really tell me if it's gonna work. The side effects suck, but I'm being told that these are my only options. So one thing that we really wanted to do is, first what we wanted to do was try to tease out, are any medications working better or worse? And how might we answer that question today? So in the FOXG1 community, we looked at all of the different seizure medications that were being used. That's what ASM stands for, it's anti-seizure medication. And what we quickly saw was that everyone is doing something totally different. So if you look at this crazy spaghetti chart on the right, each kind of row of spaghetti is a different medication pathway that someone may be on. And the bigger pathway means more patients are doing that same thing. And then a smaller spaghetti means that fewer patients are doing it. So if we look at the very first medication that people start for seizures, which is the purple spaghettis, there's like a little bit of consensus. About 1/3 of the people are started on Keppra, but everyone else is doing something different, as you can see. And then once you get into the second seizure medication that people try, everyone is doing something completely different. And so we quickly changed our strategy and realized that with data like this, we're never going to be able to tell what's working or what's not. And so now we're really focusing on kind of using this to show the neurologists in our community that we need more consensus around how we're managing rare seizure disorders, because we can't make any progress, we can't learn anything from this data, and ultimately it's the families who are suffering from that. So this has been something that we've been really excited about as an opportunity to maybe drive some more short-term improvements while we're thinking about these longer-term therapeutic strategies. All right, so lastly, I wanted to make a quick plug for one of the new tools that we are releasing to this community at Citizen. So we are calling it the AI Advocate, and the goal of this is, as we are collecting medical records for these research purposes, what are some of the ways that you might be able to use that in your regular lives to make things a little bit easier? So this is a couple GIFs showing what this tool does today. So basically, it's kind of like a chatbot that allows you to interact with the data in your medical records, and over time, within the full body of data, of course, de-identified. And it's really intended to be a way for you to get basically to reduce the amount of time that you have to spend because you don't have time. So some of the ways that we've seen other families use this tool really successfully is thinking about things like when you get an insurance denial and you have to write a letter of medical necessity or you have to write an appeal letter, this app can do that for you, and it can actually pull in the dates and relevant diagnoses from your medical records. You know, we're going back to school. Many of you will likely have IEP meetings coming up. How can you justify some of the requests that you might make, like for having a one-to-one aide or increasing the number of hours of therapy? So I think the possibilities are endless. We're really interested in hearing about your feedback and your experiences using this tool, because the goal is to make it as useful as possible. So I hope that you'll consider joining Citizen today. And then this is one of the benefits of joining. And again, we'd love to hear any feedback that you have.